It began as all pandemics do, with something small, almost insignificant. A flower, golden, radiant. Its petals shimmered like fire beneath the African sun, blooming where no other life dared to root, within the sacred earth of the Indibaya ruins. The locals revered it, called it the stairway to the sun. They believed the flower to be divine. They were wrong. In 1966, three men stepped across the threshold of that buried kingdom: Oswald E. Spencer, Edward Ashford, and James Marcus. Their expedition was no coincidence, for this flower was no mere myth or legend. Beneath the stonework of this forgotten civilization, these three men had unearthed a life form that defied natural law. They called it Progenitor. Through forgotten whispers, this obscure subject of fragmented texts and vanishing oral traditions, halfway forgotten whispers of a flower said to grant strength beyond comprehension. Spencer, a man obsessed with eugenics and the perfection of mankind, had traced these rumors through colonial-era reports, recovered missionary journals, and obscure anthropological surveys. Spencer shared the theory with Ashford and Marcus that this flower held the secret to rapid genetic evolution, yet Ashford believed it to contain a medical miracle. Marcus, on the other hand, saw an opportunity for pure scientific glory. And so, with an almost endless amount of ambition, backed by Ashford's family wealth and Spencer's vision, they ventured into the heart of West Africa to claim the bloom for themselves. Yet this plant was no cure, nor was it a miracle. It was a virus, pure and ancient, coiled inside the flower like venom in a fang. Those who consumed it either died violently or survived, only to be changed. Flesh strengthened, lifespans lengthened, cells were reborn, but always lurking beneath the surface of these mutations were a volatile instability. And yet Spencer saw potential, Marcus saw evolution. Ashford, however, saw something else: the potential for the ruin of mankind. Yet despite his ominous premonitions, the plan was collected, and the research would commence. However, despite his early reservations about the potential consequences of the virus's capacity for destruction, Ashford had no such reservations when it came to the ethical practices of neither medicine nor scientific advancements. In the eyes of these three entrepreneurs, the end always justified the means. And so, within Spencer's newly constructed mansion, in the secret laboratories, hidden well beneath the ground and prying eyes of outsiders, the research began. Yet impatient, eager to see the potential of this flower, clinical trials were scrapped, and they would instead focus on human experimentation. The trials began on an unfortunate family of three, namely the family of George Trevor, the very architect who had drawn the entire mansion, as Spencer feared that his in-depth knowledge of the blueprints would potentially fall into the wrong hands. From their research note came early observations. Just like the plant itself, the virus remained unpredictable. No host reacted the same. One subject muscles would swell beyond human limits before their bones would shatter beneath their weight. Yet another subject's skin would calcify while the mind liquefied into madness. The human trials were vast and extensive, and every breakthrough came with a corpse, and every answer to a problem came with a dying scream. Yet despite the obvious potential, the three men could not agree on how to proceed. Spencer, a man who was both cold-eyed and relentless, saw opportunity in the chaos, not for healing, but for control. With enough experimentation, he believed the virus could be shaped into a tool, a weapon, a new genesis built not by nature, but by their design. Marcus, obsessed with biological mystery, wanted freedom. Freedom from bureaucracy, freedom from restraint. He had no interest in obedience, only the raw power of guided evolution. To him, this virus was a god yet unborn. Yet Ashford grew silent. The more he had seen of the experimentation, the more he recoiled. He had once dreamed of using the virus to cure disease, to extend life, but he realized that what they had found in this flower was not medicine. Within the virus's strain was a hunger, violent, untamable, and utterly indifferent to the intent behind the creator. By 1968, only 2 years after the plant's discovery, he had begun to distance himself from the project entirely. Some say he was planning to cut ties with Spencer. Others believe he was planning to contain the project or even destroy it. But before any of that could happen, he died, exposed to the very virus he feared so deeply in what was officially deemed an accident. Yet, unofficially, many stopped believing in accidents the day Spencer smiled at the funeral. Ashford's death marked the first casualty of the virus's deeper infection. Not an infection of the body, but an infection of the soul. An infection that corrupted both moral, integrity, and ideology. And so, the unity that had unearthed the progenitor flower collapsed. The three men had stepped into the dark together, yet in this darkness, they would lose each other. In the same year of 1968, Umbrella Pharmaceuticals was founded. To the world, it was innovation, cutting-edge medicine, synthetic breakthroughs, vaccines for tomorrow. But beneath the press releases and shining facade, something far crueler, the unspeakable horrors of human experimentations continued. Spencer, now unopposed, moved quickly. With Ashford dead and Marcus increasingly isolated, he established Umbrella's inner structure, a front for full-scale virological development, and while subsidiaries distributed antacids and cough syrup, deep underground, the very structure of genetic codes were being rewritten. He called it Project W, a eugenics initiative designed to identify candidates capable of surviving and controlling the progenitor virus. His goal was simple: create a new breed of humans, loyal to himself, immune to decay, and built for dominance. Marcus, who had been left behind in the depths of Umbrella's early research wing, grew bitter. His own research led to an obsession with the virus, but not just the progenitor itself, leeches as well. And in this hopeless isolation, his research took on a life of its own. After the death of Ashford, he no longer trusted Spencer. He no longer trusted anyone. Tirelessly, he continued his work alone. Every waking hour became about the leeches in his laboratory. He taught them to mimic him, to respond to his commands, even to remember his voice. However, Spencer considered Marcus a liability, a mind too unhinged to be left unsupervised, yet far too brilliant to be left alive. But instead of acting on his impulse, he waited and watched. In the meantime, he diverted resources to Umbrella's true crucible, the Arklay research facility, hidden in the mountains above Raccoon City. And it was here the virus would be refined. Human trials resumed, failures were disposed of, early BOW experiments began, basic creatures, malformed, unstable, but promising. Spencer no longer needed backing nor cooperation. He had control of the company, he had funding, he had the virus. While Spencer was making strides and progress with his research, Marcus was slipping into delusion. He grew ever more unreliable, to a point where his isolation and erratic behavior resulted in internal investigations against him. By 1988, the order finally came down. Marcus was to be eliminated. Spencer sent his enforcers, loyal agents of Umbrella's private regime, They found Marcus in his lab, and there, among his beloved leeches, they executed him. Confident with Marcus silenced and Ashford buried, Spencer was certain no one would stand in his way. Umbrella was his kingdom now, not a company, but an empire of flesh and design. Its foundation would be the T-Virus, the first successful weaponized strain of virus, born from Marcus's research and twisted into a tool of order. But nothing born of ambition ever stays obedient, and as it turns out, death is not always the end. Despite high expectations, the T-Virus was not an immediate miracle. It was failure upon failure. Test subjects were twisted into mockeries of life, muscles liquefied in the laboratories, organs ruptured, brain functions were lost, or even worse, redirected. For at the core level, the virus did not build, it devoured. Yet in his concrete crypt beneath the Arklay mountains, Spencer's ambitions were pushed to the limit as Umbrella kept trying to achieve his vision. They called it BOWs, bioorganic weaponry, a new arms race not of bombs or bullets, but of cells and organisms. Spencer had imagined that the perfect soldier would not need to eat, or sleep, or even feel fear. He would only be able to obey. Yet the project would run into dead end after dead end, as most of the human test subjects broke apart under the weight of the virus. And yet despite all these challenges, the early failures were logged as viable assets. These were the first zombies, not accidents nor casualties, but part of the design. Yet for Spencer, these things were too crude. What he wanted was something more. A creature that retained both shape and strength, one that could follow commands and kill precisely when ordered to. It required a body strong enough to withstand the decay of the virus, and a brain just intact enough to take orders but not question them. The answer would surely come in the shape of fragments, years of gene splicing, continued studies in human enhancement, forced evolution, dozens of cadavers which were injected were most disintegrated, yet a few would adapt. They would come to name it Tyrant, the T-Virus. The Tyrant series was the first true success of Umbrella, designated T-001 through T-103. These creatures stood over 8 feet tall, armored in muscle and grafted flesh. One of the earliest subjects, T-002, was developed under Arklay in strict secrecy. It became the template for further research, not just for the development of future Tyrants, but for what Umbrella would consider acceptable post-human design. By the early 1990s, the T-Virus had been mass-produced. Factories beneath Raccoon City churned out vials like munitions, and Umbrella sold BOWs to warlords, dictators, and governments. But the T-Virus was never obedient. Behind each strain, behind every forced mutation and cloned genome, the shadow of Progenitor still whispered, wild, ancient, and unbound. No matter how much Umbrella tried to refine it, sculpt it, or name it, it refused to be tamed and mutated with every host. And though Umbrella's original objective was clear, to create a controllable bioweapon, a humanoid soldier who would be both fast, strong, and obedient, the virus itself had other ideas. Umbrella discovered that the T-Virus was not merely a chemical, it was a retroviral agent capable of rewriting life itself. When it infiltrated a host cell, it performed reverse transcriptions, injecting its RNA into the cell's DNA and in turn hijacking its machinery. The cell would then begin to pump out new viral particles, which then burst forth to infect neighboring cells. In essence, the virus doesn't just reproduce, it consumes. It replaces the mitochondria in the host cells, forcing low-efficiency energy production that keeps muscle twitching and brain screaming long after the heart itself has given out. This process causes profound necrosis, turning flesh into rot, even as some major functions still remain. Critically, and probably most important of all, the T-virus targets the frontal lobe and hypothalamus. Higher brain functions collapse, reason, memory, emotion, leaving all but the most primal survival systems intact. The result becomes a creature driven by sheer hunger, with raw strength, heightened aggression, and only one possible outcome: cannibalistic violence. However, in rare cases, estimated at about 1 in 10 million, the genetic adapters could survive nearly intact, and it was these rare outcomes that the organization was chasing. This search for the perfect candidate would take the research in all directions, mostly fruitless. Most subjects would lose their rationality, their skin would blister and be consumed by necrosis, muscles tore and regrew into alien forms, and yet Spencer would push the program forward. For among all of the failures, some subjects showed exceptional promise despite their limited capacity in the early stages of experimentation. Dogs were injected with the unstable T-virus strain and were the first candidates to show real promise. Though their bodies decayed, their aggression was highly amplified, and their retained motor function made them exceptional hunters. Umbrella named them Cerberus, the perfect candidate for field testing: cheap, disposable, and effective. Yet deeper still, in the sub-levels of the Umbrella laboratories, more sophisticated experiments were following. Through the hybridization of human DNA and reptilian traits, the researchers had engineered a viral recombination. The result was a hunter, a fast, resilient, and terrifyingly efficient killer. In its footprints would follow the liquor, born not from design but from prolonged exposure to the T-virus. When certain infected humans were left to fester and allowed to consume as much biomass as possible, they would undergo horrific secondary mutations. Their skin would dissolve, muscles expanded, brains swelling to a degree that it would burst through their skulls, eyes would disappear, and what would be left would be nothing but heat and hunger. A relentless killer tracking its subject through echolocation, a consequence of the virus adapting unchecked, not a concept of evolution, but rather biological escalation. Though none of these creatures were part of the Tyrant initiative, they were all kept, studied, and repurposed. In the madness of branching experiments, Spencer's ambition was no longer about creating the perfect soldier. It was about discovering how many shapes death could take. However, in May of 1998, something stirred beneath the Arklay research facility. It wasn't a failed experiment, rather it was a consequence of the ambitions that had turned inward. Years prior, Dr. James Marcus, who had been assassinated in his own laboratory, killed by his own colleagues, were discovered not to be dead. In a breach of containment and quarantine protocols, a strain of the T-virus managed to escape the laboratories. It was sabotage, deliberate and methodical. The air filtration systems of the laboratories were compromised, safety locks were overwritten, and Epsilon, a strain of the T-virus, began to drift particle by particle, spreading through the vents once considered sterile. By the time Umbrella's executives even noticed, the Arklay research lab had already become a tomb behind the locked doors. Loss of communications followed, and by mid-1998, containment was unraveling. The facility, which had been compromised from within, drowned in death and slaughter as the creatures contained in the facility broke out of captivity, turning on the research staff, which in turn murdered each other. Some managed to flee the facility, yet those who were unable were confined to die within the laboratory. with no means of escape. What began as a simple test in a laboratory became catastrophe, and that catastrophe leaked out not just into the entire facility, but to the mountains and eventually Raccoon City. By September, local authorities were overwhelmed. Reports of cannibalistic attacks had begun in the forest and crept into the city, yet the official response was nothing but silence. Then suddenly, the city itself began to change. Panic began outpacing the infection. Pedestrians were ambushed in the streets, police were attacked within their cruisers, and children turned on parents in their homes. Within less than a month, the radical spread of the infection left only one solution. The United States government decided to sterilize Raccoon City with a tactical nuclear strike. Nearly 100,000 lives extinguished in an instant. However, by then, it was already too late. The virus had managed to evade eradication, and what has begun as a quiet anomaly in an ancient cave, a single flower hidden beneath the soil, had now bloomed into something far more dangerous. For in Umbrella's hands, it became proof of concept. Umbrella's core research teams had long since branched beyond the Arklay model, and by the time the nuclear strike had consumed the city, the megacorporation's subdivisions, such as Umbrella Europe, were already working on continuing the research and were in the process of developing multiple variants, some of them engineered for specific environments, others for specific functions, most for military goals. Where the American branch prioritized bioorganic weapons like Tyrants and Hunters, Umbrella Europe delved into refinement. The result was new viral strains. Among them were the T-Veronica virus, developed in absolute secrecy by Alexia Ashford on Rockford Island, and later at the Antarctic base. Alexia had merged the T-virus with a Queen Ant retrovirus and chosen select plant genetic material, forming the T-Veronica, a pathogen capable of integrating with a living host at a genetic level, yet retaining both intelligence and hive control instincts. The failures of Alexander Ashford had led Alexia to freeze herself for 15 years, choosing long incubation and deep adaptation over degeneration. Only by this gestation could she become the Veronica Queen, a living node capable of commanding legions of subordinate infected. Other viruses within the Umbrella Europe's control were the Nemesis Alpha or the NE Alpha parasite, the very answer to the question of control. By grafting the Nemesis Alpha, a parasitic organism, into a T-virus carrier, such as a Tyrant, resulted in a Nemesis Type T, a weapon that could reason, strategize, and execute orders independently. Nemesis Alpha implants into the spinal cord, destroys neural pathways, and integrates into the host brain. The parasite becomes the dominant consciousness, granting intellectual capacity and obedience. It even produces secretions that spread the T-virus infections to the victims it tears apart. Yet in the aftermath of Raccoon City's fall, Umbrella would meet the full fury of the public outcry, as they were deemed responsible for the incident, and though the entire corporation collapsed, its strains of virus did not. Private militaries, rogue scientists, and biotech firms such as Tricell, Well Pharma, and Alexia-backed operatives both replicated and weaponized these strains across continents. By the early 2000s, it was clear that the T-virus was not just Umbrella's creation, it had gone far beyond the corporation. Sovereign investigations, internal collapse, and scandal dismantled Umbrella as an entity, but the virus continued to spread structurally, both from labs that had been abandoned, flasks that had been stolen, and even data which had been sold. The operational groups BSAA and TerraSafe had been formed to combat outbreaks, but found that the virus carriers had become global infrastructure. By now, bioterrorism had assumed ideological weight, and the very concept of infection became philosophy. Groups like Los Illuminados used parasitic mind control, militant factions repurposed T-Plaga hybrids as cruel tools, and the virus taught a lesson. that mindless obedience and infectious ideology travel far faster than any vaccine can be developed. Yet important is it to understand that not even nuclear or tactical fire could destroy the virus, for its existence within the wildlife, within people, and even in the wind would guarantee its continued mutation. The final contagion was never just a plague, it was the belief that mankind could be rewritten. The virus had now escaped not only the lab, but the very century it was born in. And one now has to wonder if in the following century the resistance of man were to falter, would there be any future left for humanity, or would there be nothing left but hosts of the virus? Hey there, Hazmat here. I know I'm super behind on the Resident Evil lore, but here I am, trying to catch up on it. If you enjoyed this episode, then make sure to let me know in the comments below. As always, a big thanks goes out to the Hunters Lounge, specifically the exclusive Johnny Sevens, the exclusive The Coyote, the exclusive Gitchy Boy, the exclusive War Monk, and the exclusive Rat. The VIPs, Corvo Bear Slayer, Derivative, Doug Powell, Gino Lucero, Goose, Hambone, Jim and El Bob, Corey Peterson, Michael Fornell, Mortev Menace, Hein, Slip, Stas Biestic, Sunrise Phoenix, TJ Crane, Texas Toast, and the Wizard of Copper, and of course, all the regulars. If you want to support the ongoing lore, then consider signing up as a member of the Hunters Lounge for as little as a single $1 a month. The link is in the description below. And thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.